This episode is sponsored by SumUp, the payments provider for small businesses. Choose from in-store and remote payment solutions with no monthly costs. Visit sumup.co.uk.
Welcome to the First Voice podcast, brought to you by First Voice magazine, the official flagship magazine of the Federation of Small Businesses, and the go-to podcast for news, tips, and important information for small businesses. This episode will explore what the new EU-UK agreement means for small businesses and is brought to you in partnership with SumUp, the small business payments specialists. Now that the Brexit transition period has ended and an EU-UK agreement is in place, there is much for small businesses to digest, to understand the impact on them and their operations. To explore these issues in detail, I'm joined by FSB Head of International Affairs, James Sibley, who will set out, among other things, exactly what the agreement means for you, for your supply chains, for doing business with other countries, and for exporting to Europe. James, welcome.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me.
No problem. We'll dive straight into it, James, if that's okay. There's a number of issues arising from the agreement and a number of specific and technical areas I'd like us to cover for our audience today. But I thought we could start with you sharing your overall initial reaction to it. What does FSB think of the deal generally?
So I think turning the clock back to Christmas Eve, our first reaction really was one of relief. If you think back before that, we were still faced with the prospect of no deal and the wholesale imposition of tariffs. So actually getting that deal in place and getting a zero tariff, zero quota deal like we asked for, basically, I think was a tremendous relief for us and for our members. The other thing that we were happy to see, and this is something that, again, we've been calling for a long time, is for the inclusion of a small business chapter, which was in there in the text. And that is essentially there to help small businesses, such as our members, really understand this agreement and make best use of it. Because they're going to, it's a tremendous change. So they're going to need help in understanding it and knowing how to use it. So those were our initial reactions.
Great. And there's been a lot of coverage in the media around rules of origin. It's something that a number of small business owners and managers will have heard a lot about. But what exactly are the rules of origin and what do they mean for small businesses?
So yeah, there has been a lot of coverage in the media about this recently. So I mentioned that this deal has zero tariffs and zero quotas. The sting in the tail is that those zero tariffs are unlocked via rules of origin. Essentially, rules of origin are the conditions that you have to meet in order to unlock those zero tariffs that were in the agreement. And it's a common misconception. You hear the phrase free trade agreement, and you think, there are no conditions, but this is what we're talking about. And essentially, rules of origin are there to prove that the products that you trade under this agreement are, of the nationality of the two parties to that agreement. They're essentially designed to prevent other parties from taking advantage of the reduced tariffs that you see in a free trade agreement. Now, they're very complex, so I'll do my best to explain. But basically, if you as a goods exporter, because this only applies to goods, want to trade under in this case, zero tariffs in this agreement, you essentially have to prove that your product is well, for the sake of argument, British. Now, this can be really simple. It could be that, for instance, you're a Welsh sheep farmer exporting Welsh lamb. In that case, that lamb has grown up in Wales. It's wholly obtained as the terminology goes. But it can range also to the complex. So, if you're producing a bicycle and you've got, a frame that's imported from Taiwan, but then you've also got wheels that you handmade yourself, and then it can get quite complicated. And you need to basically count up, the value of the components and then how much value added you've done in your processing in the UK. So it can get really complicated. And I recommend that any goods exporters who are listening to this, they take a look at the well, first of all, the FSB Transition Hub, but also the gov.uk guidance on rules of origin, because it can get really complex.
Yeah, brilliant. And, there's understandably a lot of the media coverage is focused on the negative aspects of the deal for small businesses and the negative impact of Brexit in general. Were there any nice surprises in the agreement? Were there things that we perhaps didn't expect to see, but are there that'll be welcomed by small businesses?
So yes, there are a few things that were quite positive. So I mentioned rules of origin. The one thing there that was quite good actually is that in the UK-EU agreement, we have self-certification, which basically means that you, as a supplier, as an exporter, rather than what is usually the case in most free trade agreements, going and buying what is called a certificate of origin for £40 to £50 per product, you can instead fill out a form called a supplier's declaration yourself, and that can cover you. So, I mean, £50 may not sound like a lot, but if you are someone who exports a lot of different products, it can really rack up. So that was quite a nice surprise. The other thing that's in there, there's a few customs easements which are going to make life easier for many small businesses. So one, for instance, was the mutual recognition of AEO status, which may not make much of a difference for individual small businesses, but those who use freight forwarders, logistics intermediaries, it will make their life easier, and it should mean that their shipments go through the border more quickly. So there were things in there to celebrate.
You mentioned businesses that supply goods when you were talking around rules of origin there, but a huge number of small businesses actually deliver services. And a big question for many people will be, what does the agreement mean for us if we sell services into the EU? What are the implications for small businesses there?
So I think there are pretty big implications for small businesses that are dealing cross-border in services. Unfortunately, in the debate on this agreement, services featured a lot less. And the other thing is that, the difference between single market membership and the kind of provisions in a free trade agreement are quite stark. So the things that services exporters need to think about is the difference in visa arrangements, for instance. So leaving the single market, you lose the freedom to provide services across the EU. That doesn't mean that you're banned, doesn't mean you can't, but there are new restrictions in place. So for instance, depending on the member state, you may need to obtain a work permit to deliver the service that you provide. There are many exemptions to that I'd suggest people check on, again, gov.uk. But it's just something to think about, and it can really vary by member state. So the example I always give is that in France, for instance, if you are going to France to attend a trade fair, you can go there on a normal visa exemption if you're just meeting customers and so on. If you're there at the trade fair and you sign a contract, then that's a bit of a grey area. But if you go to that trade fair and you assemble your stand at the trade fair, then technically you need a work permit for that activity. So it can get quite complicated, and it's worth checking on a member state by member state basis depending on where you operate. The other thing to mention on services is qualifications, professional qualifications. So in the agreement, there is something on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, but basically, as of today, there's no kind of massive mutual recognition. This is something that may come in time. But for now, if you're a services provider and you depend on a qualification, so I don't know if you are a lecturer or I don't know, a legal advisor, this kind of thing, you may need to get your professional qualification recognised in each of the markets in which you operate. So it's a lot more complicated than perhaps it was before. So those are the two things I'd draw attention to.
Obviously, a big minefield for businesses for some time now has been the management of data. Are there implications and issues for small businesses that receive data from EU countries?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting one. So in this whole debate, data has been treated separately to the negotiation of the agreement. So we've been waiting for what is called a data adequacy decision from the European Commission, which basically means that if that is granted, businesses in the UK can export and import data to and from the EU as before. Now, what we've seen is that essentially what we have is a 6-month stopgap measure while the Commission makes up its mind. So currently that adequacy decision is in place and businesses can continue as before exporting and importing personal data. But that is something to keep an eye on. And whether that decision does come in the summer of this year. In the meantime, things that small businesses should be thinking about include standard contractual clauses in their contracts. So these can be found on the ICO website, for instance. And this is a fallback method of covering yourself when you are dealing with data across borders. They're more complicated than just that. So you may require some legal advice, but that is the thing that I would draw people's attention to. There is one thing, though, in the agreement that is quite useful, which is that in the digital chapter of the agreement, data localization is banned. So if in the future you have, I don't know, a regulator or some kind of public authority in the EU saying to you, you need to store your data on a server in, I don't know, Denmark or the Czech Republic, that technically is not allowed under the agreement. So that might be something you want to bear in mind in the future.
Yeah, great stuff. And another big area for small businesses is always the issue of VAT. What are the implications from the deal of VAT and where that's paid?
Yeah, so VAT is a big one, and it is massively complicated. So I'll do my best to draw attention to a few things that have either changed or stayed the same that people should be thinking about. So the first thing to say is that for goods, for movement of goods from the UK to the EU, that is now deemed as an export. So for the majority of cases, goods exporters will be able to zero rate their exports, which is something to bear in mind. For services, it remains in most instances as place of supply. There are some exceptions to that, such as delivery of digital services, for instance. But one of the other things to draw attention to is that leaving the EU VAT area, as we now have done, means that the distance selling threshold that previously applied no longer applies. Now, in the agreement, there are provisions on mutual assistance on VAT. Now, this removes the requirement to register or appoint a fiscal representative in some member states, but it does vary by member state. We've had a bit of confusion from members on this. So what I recommend doing is talking to your accountant in the first instance, and also looking at the gov.uk guidance, and seeing whether there are any markets in the EU that you operate in where you're going to have to register, or where you may want to consider registering, or where you may have to appoint a fiscal representative. It's quite a complex patchwork that I think now members are going to have to navigate, but that is one thing to bear in mind. The other thing I'll mention for imports is that HMRC has changed the rules on duty deferment accounts. And this basically means that if you're an importer, you can pay your VAT on a monthly direct debit basis rather than per consignment. Previously, this required a financial guarantee, but this has been changed as of 1st of January. Not as many members as who are aware of this as they should be, so that's something to bear in mind, and it may help, for instance, with managing cash flow.
No, that's great. Really, really clear and insightful. Obviously, it's still only a short time since the deal was announced. So what are the next steps from here, and what is FSB calling for?
So there are a few things to keep an eye out for. So we have this big agreement in place, but there are a few things that have been really kind of left for ongoing negotiation. I've already mentioned data protection, where we are still waiting for the Commission to essentially determine whether the UK can be trusted to handle EU citizens' data by delivering this data adequacy decision. That's something that business is going to need to keep an eye on over the next 6 months. The other thing is financial services. So you'll see this reported in the news quite a lot, that there's still discussions to go on financial services and mutual recognition. That may not affect many of our members, but it's also something to bear in mind. The other thing I've already mentioned, but I can delve into a little bit more, is the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Basically, what we have in this agreement is a pretty standard EU approach, where the EU goes, this is what's possible, i.e. we could foresee the recognition of professional qualifications under this agreement, but we'll leave it to bilateral negotiations between the professional bodies in the UK and the EU. So, this is not something that's had much success in the past, but we're hopeful that the bodies involved will get cracking on this. And it affects professions all over the shop. So, architects are a good example, where in the EU-Canada agreement, they tried to do something like this. And we hope to see this kind of bilateral negotiation now kind of taking off. The other thing to bear in mind is that some easements that government have put in place are going to lapse this year. So at the moment for imports, there's not the full suite of checks taking place. That will end at the end of June. The other thing to bear in mind that I hadn't mentioned is that there's an easement in place for rules of origin. So essentially, at the moment, you're not required to supply the supplies declaration for 12 months. Now that will end at the end of this year, and after that, you'll have to make sure that you are doing the full range of paperwork for your rules of origin when you are doing your exports. So that's also something to bear in mind as businesses get used to this. In terms of what FSB is doing, we're going to be continuing to update the transition hub, which I imagine is going to be pretty useful for small businesses who are still trying to make sense of this deal. And then in terms of our asks to government, the big thing at the moment we're asking for is essentially for financial assistance in the form of transition vouchers, which would be small grants that would help small businesses buy in the advice and training that they might need to make full use of this agreement. So that could be on legal advice on contracts, it could be accountancy advice on VAT, and so on. So that's our big ask for government at the moment, and we're still making progress on that.
No, that's brilliant. James, thank you so much. Of course, that FSB Transition Hub can be found by searching FSB Transition Hub in your search engine, and is available via the FSB website. James, I think that brings us to a really good conclusion for this episode of our podcast, which has been a really insightful analysis of the new EU-UK agreement and its impact for the UK's small businesses. I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights, and also to thank our sponsors, Small Business Payments Specialists SumUp, for helping to make this podcast possible. Thanks also to our audience for listening. Please do subscribe to the First Voice podcast to receive regular updates and guidance on the big issues affecting small businesses. And if you'd like to read more on this topic and others affecting small businesses across the UK, then of course the First Voice website, firstvoice.fsb.org.uk, has lots of information and guidance for you. Thanks very much.
This episode is sponsored by SumUp, the payments provider for small businesses. Choose from in-store and remote payment solutions with no monthly costs. Visit sumup.co.uk.